Are there some sins that are worse than others? The biblical answer is yes. Sometimes I hear people say that, oh, to God, all sins are the same. And I don't think that's actually true. Sometimes it's quoted when Jesus says, from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 or 6, where he says, if a man looks at a woman lustfully, he's already committed adultery in his heart, as if to say, lusting is the same as adultery. And that's not what Jesus says. What he's saying is lusting is really bad. He doesn't say all sins are equal. He says the things that we try to minimize, those are worse than we think. There are sins that are more detrimental to our souls. And we get into that a little bit in the book of Leviticus. We're starting Leviticus. This is a book of the Bible that most of us maybe stop reading our Bible or skip over, but don't do that. There's some really interesting things that we can learn about sin and the penalty of sin and the danger of sin and how God dealt with sin in the Old Testament, looking ahead to the work of Jesus. Now, the book of Leviticus, remember, is coming off of Exodus, how Exodus ends where Moses is standing in front of the tabernacle. The glory of the Lord comes down, and because the glory of the Lord has entered the tabernacle, Moses cannot enter the tabernacle. And so now the book of Leviticus explains how we can enter into the tabernacle. And it begins with the first 4 chapters talking about, in general, these different types of sacrifices. You have the burnt offering, the grain offering, the fellowship offering, the sin offering, the guilt offering. And he's just giving kind of instruction as to how to use these offerings. Later on in the book, he'll explain why each one is important and what is the order. Actually, it's in the opposite order that you would give these. You would give first the sin or the guilt offering, pay for your guilt, then you also pay for your sin. Then you would move on to the fellowship offering. Now you're in fellowship with God and his people. And then you would end with a burnt offering, which is a whole burnt offering, which is now a new commitment to God. And something else comes up here that I want to talk about. It talks about unintentional sins, that these sins, the sin offering, the guilt offering, are unintentional sins. Now, what does that mean? Well, these sins are different than what Pharaoh was doing. Remember in the book of Exodus how Pharaoh was warned over and over again, let my people go, and he continued to harden his heart and intentionally tried to manipulate God, intentionally tried to run the show. And after he hardened his heart, there was really no room for sacrifice of sins left, because there's no openness to it. There's no open to forgiveness. It was intentional manipulation, intentional sin. And so that's what we need to be careful about. Be careful that we don't harden our heart to God's call to repentance. That if we continue to harden our heart, we'll walk into intentional sin, thinking that we have to manipulate the situation. We harden our heart to God and his power and his justice. Psalm 19 talks about that. At the end of Psalm 19, it says, who can discern his errors? Forgive my hidden faults. There's so many sins that I do. I don't even know all of them that I do. But then it says, keep me from willful sins. May they not rule over me. That's really dangerous. Once we start saying, sin doesn't really matter, it's not that big of a deal, and you keep doing that, it creates a callous on your heart, a hardness on your heart. And as it says in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 26 and 27, after a while, that hardening gets so hard, like with Pharaoh, that there's no sacrifice for sins left. So keep reading the book of Leviticus. I'll walk with you through this book, and hopefully this helps.